Ondine had always believed the world was divided into two distinct categories: things that were heavy and things that were heavier. The laundry basket, overflowing with the Alpha King's personal linens, definitely belonged to the latter. It dug into her hip bones, the wicker screaming in protest with every step she took up the winding stone staircase to the royal wing. Her world was one of lie, steam, and the muted sense of other people's lives. She spent her days with her arms plunged in scalding water, her hands raw and red, scrubbing away the grime and sweat of the pack. But the king's laundry was different. It was a chore whispered about in the wash house, a punishment and a privilege all at once. His sheets smelled of something she couldn't name: ozone after a lightning strike, the deep, clean scent of pine forests, and an undercurrent of wild, untamed power that made her own small omega wolf want to curl up and hide. The scent clung to the fine linen, potent and overwhelming. It was the scent of authority, of absolute command. It was the scent of King Theron, the silent king, who had ruled their coastal kingdom of Saltspire for 20 years without speaking a single word. With each step, Ondine's head grew lighter. The stone walls seemed to sway. She hadn't eaten since the sliver of bread she'd had at dawn, and the relentless summer heat radiating from the stones was stealing the strength from her limbs. Just a few more flights, she told herself, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The basket seemed to gain weight, anchoring her to the ground. His scent, which usually was just a background note of intimidating power, was intensifying with every step she took closer to his chambers. It was as if the air itself was growing thick with it, pressing in on her, making the air too rich to breathe. Her vision started to tunnel, the edges blurring into a dark, swimming haze. She could feel the frantic, panicked thrum of her own heart against her ribs. Just make it to the landing, she pleaded with her own failing body. Just drop the basket and run. But her knees had other ideas. They buckled without permission. The world tilted on its axis, a dizzying, nauseating spin. The heavy basket slipped from her numb fingers, tumbling down a few steps with a clatter of wicker on stone. The last thing Ondine was aware of was the scent. His scent. It wasn't just on the linens anymore. It was suddenly, impossibly, there, fresh, alive. It rushed over her not as a memory on cloth, but as a living presence, a wave of ozone and pine that consumed everything else just as the blackness finally took her. She awoke to the bewildering sensation of silk. It slid against her cheek, cool and impossibly smooth. For a groggy moment, she thought she must be dreaming. The only fabric she ever touched was coarse linen, rough wool, or the worn cotton of her own thin shift. Silk was for high-born ladies, for the Luna who did not exist. A low rhythmic sound filled the air, the gentle crash of waves against rock. It was a familiar sound, the heartbeat of Saltspire Keep, but it was clearer than she'd ever heard it, not muffled by the thick lower walls of the servant quarters. A breeze, salty and clean, drifted over her skin, carrying the scent of the sea and him. Ozone and pine. Ondine's eyes snapped open. She was not in her narrow cot. She was in a bed so vast it felt like its own continent, the silken sheets pooling around her like liquid moonlight. Towering stone walls rose to a timbered ceiling, and through a massive arched window, the gray expanse of the ocean stretched to the horizon. This was not the servants' wing. This was the heart of the keep, the heart of power. Panic seized her, cold and sharp. She sat up, the silk sheet falling away to reveal she was still in her threadbare work shift. And then she felt it, a sharp, stinging burn on the curve of her shoulder, where her shift had slipped down. Her head whipped around, her long, tangled brown hair falling over her face. She pushed it back with a trembling hand and looked. There, on her skin, was a mark. It was not a bruise or a scratch. It was intricate, a swirling pattern of lines that felt both raw and ancient, the skin around it red and tender. It was a bite, a claiming mark, freshly made. A strangled gasp escaped her lips. Her blood ran cold. She knew what this was. Every wolf, from the highest alpha to the lowest omega, knew. It was the mark of a mated pair, a bond forged in instinct and sealed by tooth and claw, a mark an alpha gives to his chosen. Her mind reeled, a chaotic storm of impossibility. Who? How? She remembered the stairs, the weight of the basket, the dizziness, and then nothing. Nothing but the overwhelming sense of his scent just before she fell. The heavy oak door to the chamber creaked open. Ondine froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. A figure filled the doorway, a silhouette against the light of the corridor. He was immense, his shoulders so broad they seemed to strain the very fabric of his dark tunic. He stepped inside, and the room seemed to shrink around him. It was him, Alpha King Theron. His hair was the color of a raven's wing, long and unbound, falling around a face that looked as if it were carved from the very cliffs the keep was built upon. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, found hers across the expanse of the room. He didn't look angry, he didn't look pleased. He looked nothing. His expression was a mask of stoic control, unreadable and absolute. And he was silent. Of course, he was silent. He was always silent. He just stood there, watching her. The air crackled with his presence, a palpable pressure that made the candle flames on a nearby table gutter and dance. Her Omega wolf, which had been cowering in terror, did something utterly baffling. It whimpered, not in fear, but in a strange, aching sort of recognition. It was a feeling she had never experienced, a pull toward the very source of her panic. Ondine stared at him, then at the burning mark on her shoulder, then back at the silent, imposing king. She opened her mouth to ask, to scream, to demand what had happened, but no sound came out. What could she possibly say? "Excuse me, Your Majesty. I seem to have misplaced several hours of my life and woken up with your permanent, life-altering claim on my body. Any thoughts on the matter?" The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He took a slow step into the room, his boots making no sound on the stone floor. He was a predator, graceful and lethal. His gaze never left hers, and in their depths, she saw a flicker of something. Not anger, not lust. Something that looked terrifyingly like turmoil. She was a laundry maid. He was the Alpha King. And somehow, in the black void of her unconsciousness, the world had been turned completely upside down. She had fainted carrying his laundry, and she had woken up his. He moved with a deliberate, unnerving grace. For a man his size, he was utterly silent. He crossed the vast chamber to a side table and poured a glass of water from a silver pitcher. The only sounds were the gentle splash of water and the frantic pounding of Ondine's own heart. She watched his hands. They were large, calloused, a warrior's hands, yet his movements were steady and precise. He brought the glass to the bedside table, placing it down without a single tremor. He didn't look at her, but she felt his awareness of her like a physical touch. His scent was a constant swirling presence, pine, sea salt, and something that smelled like charged air before a storm. It was overwhelming, but underneath it, a new scent was beginning to emerge, something she could only just detect. It was the scent of anxiety? No, that wasn't right. It was deeper than that, a profound, bone-deep disquiet. Ondine finally found her voice, though it came out as a ragged whisper. "Your Majesty," he stopped, his back to her. He didn't turn, but she saw the muscles in his broad shoulders tense beneath his tunic. What happened?" she managed, her hand instinctively flying to the mark on her shoulder, the skin still hot to the touch. "This mark." He remained silent. The silence was not empty. It was a living thing, a wall he built around himself. Stories were whispered in the kitchens and barracks about why he never spoke. Some said a witch had cursed him. Others said he'd taken a vow after the brutal Northern War that had cost him his parents. No one knew for sure. They only knew the silence and the crushing authority that needed no words. He turned slowly, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers. There was no explanation in them, no comfort. There was only that raw, contained turmoil. He gave a short, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It wasn't a denial, it felt like a refusal. A refusal to explain. Ondine's fear began to curdle into a strange, desperate frustration. You can't do this and say nothing, she cried, her voice cracking. I was bringing your laundry. I fainted. And now? Now I wake up here, like this. She gestured wildly at the mark, the bed, the opulent room that was so far from her world, it might as well be the moon. His expression didn't change, but his scent did. The smell of disquiet intensified, laced with a sharp, bitter edge of what she could only identify as self-reproach. He looked at the mark on her shoulder, and for a fleeting instant, his mask of control slipped. A deep, profound pain flashed in his eyes, so stark and naked it stole her breath. Then it was gone, shuddered away as quickly as it had appeared. He took a step toward her. Ondine flinched back, pressing herself against the carved headboard. His hand came up, and she braced herself for, she didn't know what. A blow? A dismissal? Instead, his fingers brushed against the rumpled sleeve of her shift, his touch surprisingly gentle as he tugged it back into place to cover the mark. The brief contact sent a jolt through her, a spark that arced from his skin to hers and lit up the new, fragile bond between them. Through it, she felt a dizzying rush of his emotion, not just the pain and regret she'd seen, but a fierce, overwhelming wave of protectiveness. It was so strong, it was dizzying, a primal instinct that had nothing to do with thought or reason. It was the pure, undiluted feeling of mine. He dropped his hand as if burned, taking a step back. The connection snapped, leaving Ondine breathless and confused. He had marked her, he regretted it. And yet, his wolf was screaming that she belonged to him. It made no sense. Just then, a sharp, commanding knock echoed from the heavy oak door. Theron? Theron, I demand you open this door. The council is in an uproar. They say a servant girl was brought here. What is the meaning of this? The voice was female, cultured, and laced with steel. Ondine saw King Theron's jaw tighten. The protective aura she'd felt through the bond flared again, this time directed outwards, a low growl rumbling in his chest, so deep it was more a vibration than a sound. He turned his back on Ondine and strode to the door, a silent, immovable wall of power. He didn't open it. He simply stood before it, a clear and unspoken denial of entry. Do not ignore me, Theron, the voice shrieked, the decorum slipping. I am Lady Isolde. Your intended. You will answer to me. His intended? Ondine's heart sank like a stone. Of course. The king would have a high-born lady chosen for him, a woman of power and status, not a nameless, half-starved laundry maid. The situation was worse than she could have possibly imagined. She wasn't just mistakenly marked. She was an obstacle, a scandal, a nobody who had somehow stumbled into the path of a powerful, ambitious noblewoman. Through the thick oak, Ondine could smell her, an expensive, cloying perfume of night-blooming jasmine, and underneath it, something sharp and sour, the unmistakable scent of jealousy and thwarted ambition. The pounding on the door continued, insistent and furious. King Theron did not move. He was a mountain, a force of nature, and the storm of Lady Isolde's rage broke against him, uselessly. He was protecting the room. He was protecting her. Ondine pressed a hand to her mouth, the confusing, contradictory evidence of his actions making her head spin. He wouldn't speak to her. He wouldn't explain, but he would stand as her silent guardian against the fury of the woman he was meant to marry. The hours that followed were a silent, surreal ordeal. Theron did not leave the room, and Ondine did not leave the bed. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage, trapped by a bond she didn't understand, and a king who refused to speak. Later, he had food brought. A servant, a young man with wide, terrified eyes, left a heavy tray on a table near the door and fled without a word, refusing to even look in her direction. Theron brought the tray to her. It was laden with roasted chicken, fresh bread, cheese, and fruit. More food than she typically saw in a week. Her stomach rumbled, a loud, embarrassing betrayal in the quiet room. She stared at the food, then at him. He gestured toward the tray with a slight inclination of his head. An order, eat. She shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. I can't. His brow furrowed, a silent question. I can't eat until you tell me what's going on, she whispered, hating the tremor in her voice. Please, I need to understand. He stared at her for a long moment, the silence stretching. Then he picked up a piece of bread and a slice of cheese and held it out to her. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a statement. His gaze was intense, unwavering. The unspoken message was clear. Your questions can wait. Your well-being cannot. Defeated, she took the food. Her fingers brushed against his, and again that jolt of connection shot through her. This time it carried a flicker of satisfaction from him, a quiet approval that she was taking care of herself. She nibbled on the bread, her hunger warring with her fear. He watched her eat every bite, his posture that of a sentry, his expression unreadable. Later that afternoon, another visitor was granted entry, an elderly woman with kind, wrinkled eyes and hands stained with herbs. She introduced herself as Ilara, the pack's healer. The king summoned me, she said, her voice a gentle balm in the tense room. Theron stood by the window, his back to them, but Ondine knew he was listening to every word. He wishes me to look at your shoulder, and to ensure you are well after your collapse. Ondine allowed Ilara to gently push the collar of her shift aside. The healer drew in a sharp breath as she saw the mark. By the ancients, she murmured, her fingertips hovering over the reddened skin. A full alpha's claim, and the king's no less. She met Ondine's terrified eyes with a look of sympathy. You must be very frightened, child. Ondine could only nod, tears welling. Ilara began to gently clean the area with a cool, soothing salve that smelled of chamomile and mint. Deep breaths. The first few days of a new bond can be disorienting, especially one this powerful and formed so suddenly. Her hands were gentle, her touch professional, but as she worked, she paused, her brow furrowed in concentration. She leaned closer, not to the mark, but to Ondine's neck, and inhaled softly. That's strange, Ilara murmured, more to herself than to Ondine. What is? Ondine asked, her voice tight. Your scent, the healer said, her eyes distant with memory. Underneath the laundry soap and the king's claim, there's something else, something I haven't smelled in many, many years. She looked at Ondine, truly looked at her gaze searching. It smells of wildflowers from the northern cliffs, the kind that only grow after a summer storm. My mother used to say it was the scent of the alpha line of the Silver Creek pack. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. But that's impossible. They're all gone. Perished in the border fires 20 years ago. From the window, King Theron went utterly still. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with a sudden, suffocating tension. Ondine felt a wave of pure, undiluted agony wash over her through the bond, so potent it made her gasp. It was his, a grief so profound, so ancient. It felt like a physical wound. Ilara didn't seem to notice the shift. She finished her work, patting Ondine's arm. There, that should ease the burning. Try to rest, child. Everything will make more sense in time. But as the healer left, Ondine was left with more questions than ever. The northern cliffs, the Silver Creek pack, the border fires, and a king whose silent grief was a roar she could suddenly, terrifyingly, feel in her own soul. That night, sleep would not come. Every time Ondine closed her eyes, she saw the raw pain in Theron's face, felt the echo of his grief through the bond. He did not return to the bed. He sat in a large armchair by the hearth, where a low fire burned against the evening chill, and watched the flames. He was a statue carved from shadow and sorrow. The bond between them was a strange, new thing. It felt like a humming wire stretched taut in her chest, vibrating with his proximity and his mood. It was through this connection that she began to understand what his silence hid. It wasn't coldness or cruelty. It was a cage of his own making, built around a core of monumental, unending pain. Lying in the dark, Ondine let her thoughts drift, not to her own fear, but to him. Who was he, This man who commanded a kingdom without a voice. This king who marked a laundry maid by accident and now guarded her with a fierce, silent intensity. This alpha whose grief was so vast it could be felt across a room. And then she felt it. A deliberate, gentle pulse through the bond. It wasn't the chaotic wash of his ambient emotions. It was a clear, focused sending. A feeling of inquiry. He was reaching out to her, not with hands or words, but through the connection his own wolf had forged. Hesitantly, she focused on the humming wire in her chest. She didn't know how, but she tried to push a feeling back. Not fear, not anger, just confusion. A quiet, questioning sort of bewilderment. A soft sigh came from the man in the chair. It was the first sound she had heard him make, other than the low growl at the door. It was a sound of immense weariness. Another pulse came from him. Stronger this time. It was an image, a feeling, more than a thought. The scent of wood smoke, the sound of shouting, the searing heat of a fire, and a feeling of terrible, helpless failure. It was a memory. His memory. He was showing her a piece of his pain. The revelation was staggering. He was communicating. Not in a language she knew, but in the primal language of the bond. It was raw, unfiltered, and devastatingly intimate. He was showing her the source of his sorrow, the event that had clearly shaped his entire life. The border fires Ilara had spoken of. Slowly, carefully, Ondine sat up. The firelight cast his face in flickering gold and deep shadow. His eyes were closed, his expression tight with the effort of sharing the memory. She slipped out of the massive bed, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. She padded over to the hearth and knelt on the rug before his chair. She didn't speak. What was there to say? Instead, she did the only thing she could think of. She reached out and gently laid her hand on his knee. His eyes snapped open. The storm in them was raging. The bond flared, a brilliant, blinding flash of sensation. She felt his shock, his loneliness, and a desperate, aching gratitude that was so profound it brought tears to her eyes. He didn't pull away. He didn't move at all. He just let her hand rest there, a tiny point of contact in a vast, silent sea of shared grief. And for the first time since she'd woken up in his bed, Ondine didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like an anchor. His hand, which had been clenched into a fist on the arm of the chair, slowly uncurled. He turned it over, palm up. An invitation. Trembling, Ondine placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, engulfing her small hand in his warmth. The bond between them settled, humming with a quiet, steady light. In the silence of the king's chambers, surrounded by his unspoken pain, a new language was being born. The world outside the king's chambers ceased to exist. For 3 days, Ondine lived in a strange bubble of silence and heightened senses. She learned that the slight tilt of Theron's head was a question. A muscle ticking in his jaw was irritation. The soft, almost invisible softening around his eyes was the closest he came to a smile. He communicated through action. He brought her books from the vast library, leaving them on her bedside table without a word. He chose histories, collections of poetry, and tales of the old wolves. He brought her a tray of shells, all of them perfect, sea-smoothed, and pearlescent. He was showing her his world, the things he valued, the beauty he saw. And she talked. She filled the silence with the small, unimportant details of her life. She told him about the brutal hierarchy of the wash house, about the one scrawny cat that would let her pet it, about her secret love for the sweet buns the bakers made on feast days. She talked because his silence seemed to demand it, and because as she spoke, she could feel his attention on her, a focused, unwavering beam. Through the bond, she felt his quiet interest, his amusement, and sometimes a pang of sorrow when she spoke of a hardship. He was listening with more than his ears. One evening, a fierce storm rolled in from the sea, battering the castle with wind and rain. The walls of the keep were thick, but the howl of the wind was a mournful, frightening sound. Thunder cracked, and the whole tower seemed to shudder. Ondine jumped, a small cry escaping her lips. Theron was across the room in an instant. He didn't touch her, but he stood close, a solid, reassuring presence between her and the raging storm outside. He looked at her, then at the window where rain lashed against the thick glass. then back at her. A question was in his eyes. Are you afraid? She nodded, feeling foolish. I've never liked storms. He considered this for a moment. Then, he walked to a large wooden chest at the foot of the bed. He opened it and pulled out a thick, heavy blanket woven from dark gray wool. It was his. It smelled richly of him, of pine and the sea. He came back and, with a surprising gentleness, draped it around her shoulders. The weight of it was comforting, and his scent enveloped her, a shield against the storm's fury. She pulled it tighter, burying her face in the soft wool. Thank you, she whispered. He simply nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a long moment before he returned to his chair by the fire. But the message was clear. I will keep you safe. The bond was their true medium of communication. It was a constant hum in her chest, a river of his emotions flowing just beneath the surface of her own. She learned to read the subtle currents, the deep, steady flow of his focus when he was reviewing scrolls and reports, the sharp, cold spike of his anger when a courtier displeased him, the warm, gentle eddy of his contentment when she was near, and beneath it all, there was always the deep, slow-moving tide of his grief. It was a part of him, as elemental as the stone of his keep or the sea that surrounded it. She was beginning to understand that his silence wasn't a punishment or a curse. It was a memorial. This fragile peace, however, was not meant to last. Lady Isolde had been denied, but she had not been defeated. He was in the deep, quiet place, the place of memory and silence he had inhabited for 20 years. When the laundry girl, Ondine, his mind supplied, the name a strange foreign sound even in his thoughts, had fainted. It had been like a lightning strike in that quiet place. For a moment, the world had been nothing but scent, not the scent of an omega, but the scent of an alpha. Dormant, hidden, but undeniably there, the scent of Silver Creek wildflowers after a storm, the scent of his childhood friend, Alpha Garrett, the scent of a ghost, his wolf, the great beast that had slept under a thick blanket of grief and duty for 2 decades, had woken with a roar. It had recognized 2 things at once, mate, and the last of a bloodline he had failed to protect. The claiming had not been a choice. It had been an instinct deeper than thought, a desperate primal act. Mine to protect, mine to save, will not fail again. And now he was trapped. He had bound himself to the living embodiment of his greatest failure. Ondine, the daughter of the man he had considered an older brother, lost in the fire he believed his own youthful arrogance had provoked. He had been a prince then, eager to prove his strength, pushing for a confrontation at the border. A skirmish had escalated. A torch had been thrown. The dry summer grass had erupted into an inferno. He had lost his parents. Garrett had lost his entire family, his pack scattered to the winds, their lands absorbed by Saltspire. And he had lost his voice, choked on the ash and the guilt. He had sworn to the moon and the sea that he would never speak again, his silence a penance for the words that had led to so much death. How could he ever explain this to her? How could he look at her, the last remnant of that tragedy, and tell her that the man who had claimed her was the same man responsible for her family's destruction? He watched her now, sleeping in his bed. The wool blanket he'd given her clutched under her chin. Her scent was a soft, calming presence in the room, slowly overriding the stale air of his grief. She was filling the empty spaces in his life, in his keep, in his heart, and it terrified him. He could feel her confusion through the bond, her fear, her cautious, budding trust. He treasured every word she spoke to him, hoarding them like jewels. She was giving him her stories, her life, while he could only give her silence and the echoes of his pain. When she touched him, it was like the sun breaking through the perpetual storm clouds of his soul. Her small hand in his was a tether to the present, a promise that not everything was lost in the ashes of the past. Her presence was a balm, and it was a torment, because he knew that when she learned the truth, this fragile peace would shatter. She would look at him not with curiosity and a hesitant warmth, but with the hatred he so richly deserved. He felt a familiar self-loathing rise in his throat. He had taken everything from her, her family, her name, her past, and now, in his selfish, instinct-driven need, he had taken her future too. He had marked her, trapping her with the ghost who haunted her bloodline. A pulse of distress, sharp and unintentional, shot from him through the bond. In the bed, Undine stirred, a soft frown creasing her brow in her sleep. She whimpered, the sound cutting through his dark thoughts. Even in her dreams, his pain touched her. He stood and walked to the bed, looking down at her. Her face, so open and vulnerable in sleep, was a study in contradictions. She was a servant, yet she carried the blood of alphas. She was small and slight, yet her spirit was resilient. She should hate him, she should fear him, but instead, she had shown him a kindness he had forgotten existed. Gently, so as not to wake her, he reached out and brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His wolf purred in his chest, a deep rumbling sound of pure contentment. Mate, safe, ours. But the man, the king, the architect of her suffering, felt nothing but the cold dread of the coming dawn. Sooner or later, the truth would come out, and he would lose her. The only question was when. The confrontation came sooner than he expected. It was Lady Isolde who forced his hand. She arrived not alone, but with two of the most senior members of his council, their faces grim and disapproving. They did not knock. They used the authority of their station to have the guards open the doors. Undine was sitting by the window, reading one of the books he had given her. She gasped and scrambled to her feet, clutching the book to her chest like a shield. Theron rose from his desk, his body instantly positioning itself between Undine and the intruders. A low growl started in his chest. His silent warning was clear. Isolde's lips curled into a triumphant sneer. Her scent was sharp with malice. "My king," she said, her voice dripping with false deference. "Forgive this intrusion, but matters of state security cannot wait. We have discovered a threat in our very midst." Elder Kell, a stern man with a gray beard, cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, Lady Isolde has brought a grave matter to our attention. This girl," he gestured dismissively toward Undine. "She is not who she seems." Isolde stepped forward, a nasty glint in her eyes. "For days, I have had my staff investigate the origins of this laundry maid who so mysteriously found her way into your bed. And they found something most interesting in her meager belongings." She held up a small folded piece of cloth. It was scorched and grimy, but the crest embroidered on it was still visible. A leaping silver wolf against a backdrop of 3 mountain peaks, the sigil of the Silver Creek Pack. Undine stared at it, her face paling. She had no memory of ever seeing it before. "The crest of our old enemies," Isolde announced, her voice ringing with condemnation. "The pack that cost your own beloved parents their lives. This girl is a spy, a viper sent to infiltrate our keep, perhaps to finish the job her family started." Undine shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "No, I don't know what that is." "Silence, whelp," Isolde snapped. Theron took a menacing step forward, and Isolde flinched back, but her victory was already lighting up her face. She had cornered him. He had claimed an enemy. In the eyes of the council, it was an unforgivable betrayal. But then another figure appeared in the open doorway. It was Alara, the healer, her face etched with urgency. She must have heard the commotion. "My apologies, my king councilman," she said, bowing her head before her eyes fell on the scorched cloth in Isolde's hand. She stopped dead, her eyes widened. She stared at the crest, then at Undine's terrified face. "That crest," Alara whispered, her voice trembling with dawning realization. She took a step into the room, her gaze fixed on Undine. "The scent of wildflowers. The Silver Creek Alpha line." She looked directly at Theron, her eyes shining with a wild, impossible hope. "My king, 20 years ago, Alpha Garrett and his Luna had a daughter, an infant. She was in the nursery when the fire struck. Her body was never found. They said she was lost to the flames, turned to ash." Alara's voice rose, filled with awe. "But what if she wasn't? What if someone got her out? A servant? A loyal guard? What if she survived?" Everyone in the room stared at Undine, who stood frozen, the book slipping from her numb fingers to land with a soft thud on the floor. Alara's voice dropped to a whisper, but it carried the weight of a prophecy. "That scent. King Theron, look at her. She is not just a spy from an enemy pack. She is Undine, daughter of Alpha Garrett and Luna Anya. She is the last of her line. She is alive." The world tilted and fell away. The healer's words echoed in the cavernous space of the room, each one a hammer blow against the fragile sense of self Ondine had possessed. Daughter of Alpha Garrett, the last of her line. It was impossible. She was Ondine from the wash house. She was calloused hands and an aching back. She was nobody. But in the stunned silence, things began to click into place with horrifying clarity. The familiar scent Alara had noticed. The king's profound, soul-deep grief connected to the border fires. The instinctive, possessive way his wolf had claimed her, not just as a mate, but as something precious that had been lost and found. She looked at Theron. His face was a mask of pure agony. The truth was out, and it was worse than anything she could have imagined. This man, who had shown her the first kindness she'd known in years, who had protected her and shared his silent pain with her. He was the son of her family's greatest enemy. His family had been responsible for the destruction of hers. Lady Isolda's face was a picture of fury. Her plan had backfired spectacularly. She had meant to expose a spy, not reveal a long-lost alpha heiress. Her accusation of witchcraft now looked like a desperate, foolish lie. "She lies," Isolde shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Alara. "This is a trick." But no one was listening. Elder Kyle was staring at Ondine, his eyes wide, seeing not a servant girl, but the ghost of a rival power. The political implications were staggering. The king had claimed the sole surviving heir of the pack they had conquered. Ondine felt a wave of nausea. She wasn't a person anymore. She was a symbol. A political crisis. A claim that could either unite two old enemies or tear the kingdom apart. And Theron? He hadn't chosen her. His wolf had chosen her bloodline. His instinct had reacted to her identity. It wasn't about her. The fragile trust she had built with him, the silent language they had started to create. It all felt like a lie. He had known. He must have recognized her scent from the moment she collapsed. His silence was not just grief. It was guilt. His protection was not for her, but for the relic she represented. She had to get out. The room was suffocating, the weight of their stares pressing down on her. She felt like a specimen under glass. Without a thought, she turned and ran. She ignored Isolde's cry of outrage, the councilman's shocked gasp. She ran past Theron, flinching away as he reached for her. The brief contact of his fingers on her arm sent a jolt of his desperation through the bond. A frantic, silent plea. "Wait, don't go." But she couldn't. She burst out of the chambers and fled down the corridor, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to escape the man whose guilt had become her cage. She found her way to the battlements, the part of the castle that faced the open sea. The storm from the night before had passed, but the wind was still strong and cold, whipping her hair across her face and tearing at her thin shift. It smelled of salt and rain and freedom. She gripped the cold, damp stone of the parapet, her knuckles white. Below, the gray sea churned, crashing against the rocks in a spray of white foam. Her whole life had been a lie. She wasn't an orphan of no one. She was the orphan of a tragedy, a princess raised in rags, and she had never even known it. And the man who had claimed her soul was the heir to the throne that had been built on her family's ashes. The intimacy she had felt with him, the silent understanding. It was all poisoned now by the truth. His every kind gesture felt like an act of penance, every protective stance a reflection of his guilt. Footsteps echoed behind her. She didn't have to turn around. She could feel him. His presence was a weight in the air, his scent a familiar ache in her heart. The bond between them thrummed with his distress. He stopped a few feet behind her. He didn't speak. He just stood there, a dark, silent figure against the stormy sky. "Why?" she whispered, her voice snatched away by the wind. "Why didn't you tell me?" Silence. She turned to face him, her anger a hot, sharp thing. "You knew, didn't you? From the beginning. You knew who I was." He couldn't lie. She saw the truth in his eyes. A slight, almost imperceptible nod. The betrayal was a physical blow. "All of it," she said, her voice breaking. "The food, the blankets, the books. It was all for her, wasn't it? For the daughter of Alpha Garrett. a ghost you felt you owed something to. It was never for me, for Ondine. A wave of pure anguish hit her from him, so strong it made her stagger. No, the feeling screamed through the bond. For you, only for you. But she couldn't trust it. She couldn't separate the man from his guilt. Your claim, she choked out, her hand going to the mark on her shoulder. It's not a bond. It's a chain. You've chained me to my family's murderer. That word, murderer, struck him like a physical blow. He flinched, his face paling, the mask of control shattering to reveal the raw, gaping wound beneath. The pain that rolled off him was so immense, so absolute, she felt an echo of it in her own chest. He took a step toward her, his hand outstretched, a desperate plea in his eyes. "Don't," she sobbed, taking a step back. "Don't touch me." His hand fell to his side. He looked utterly broken. He had no words to defend himself, no way to explain the tangled mess of instinct, grief, and the genuine, growing affection he felt for her. His silence, once a shield, was now an insurmountable wall between them. He accepted her rejection. He stopped moving toward her, simply stood there in the wind and the salt spray, letting her have the space she so clearly needed. His surrender was more painful than any argument. He believed he deserved this. He believed he deserved her hatred. And in that moment, seeing the King of Saltspire look so utterly defeated, Ondine believed their story was over before it had even truly begun. She had woken up in his bed, bound to him. But now, standing on the edge of his kingdom, she had never felt more alone. Ondine found refuge in the one place no one would think to look for the king's mate, the kitchens. She huddled in a dark, forgotten corner of the dry stores, curled up behind sacks of flour, and let the tears come. She wept for the parents she never knew, for the life that was stolen from her, and for the man whose silent pain had become inextricably tangled with her own. The bond was a dull, constant ache in her chest, a hollow echo of Theron's despair. She must have fallen into an exhausted sleep, because she was awoken by voices from the adjoining pantry, 2 kitchen maids, their voices low and urgent. "Heard it from Lady Isolda's own handmaiden," one whispered. "She's telling everyone the king has been bewitched, that the northern girl is a plant, sent to assassinate him and reclaim her ancestral lands." "Nonsense," the other scoffed. "The king could snap her in two, but Lady Isolda? She's the dangerous one. I saw her talking to the royal apothecary, asking about sleep aids for the king. Said his grief was keeping him awake." "Sleep aids?" the first maid said, her voice laced with suspicion. "Since when does Lady Isolda care for the king's sleep? She wants his throne." A cold dread trickled down Ondine's spine. She remembered the sour scent of Isolda's ambition, the venom in her voice. Isolda hadn't wanted to expose a spy for the good of the kingdom. She had wanted to remove a rival. Now that Ondine had been revealed as a highborn alpha, she was an even greater threat. A threat that Isolda would be desperate to eliminate. And the easiest way to do that was to get rid of the king who had claimed her. Poison. The word slammed into her mind with the force of a physical blow. A slow-acting poison, disguised as a sleeping draught. With Theron dead, the claim would fade. Ondine, the northern assassin, would be the perfect scapegoat. Isolda could seize control of the council in the ensuing chaos, painting herself as the savior of the kingdom. The bond in Ondine's chest, which had been a dull ache, suddenly flared hot with alarm. It wasn't her fear. It was a wave of fierce, primal terror coming from her own wolf. Our mate is in danger. In that instant, everything else fell away. The betrayal, the confusion, the pain of her lost past. All of it was incinerated by a single, blazing certainty. She would not let that woman harm him. She was no longer Ondine the laundry maid, or Ondine the lost princess. She was his mate, and her place was at his side. She scrambled out of the storeroom and ran, not away from him this time, but towards him. She flew through the castle corridors, ignoring the shocked stares of guards and servants. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Protect him, protect him, protect him. She burst into the throne room. It was a scene of tense, formal theater. The council was assembled. Theron sat on the massive carved stone throne, his face like granite, his eyes empty. Lady Isolda stood before him, holding a silver goblet. "A gift, my king," Isolda was saying, her voice smooth as oil. To soothe your troubled mind, a spiced wine to help you rest. Ondine saw it all in a horrifying tableau. The triumphant gleam in Isolde's eyes, the faint, bitter almond scent clinging to the wine, the weary resignation on Theron's face. He was so lost in his own guilt and grief that he didn't even see the threat. He was going to accept it. No! The word was torn from Ondine's throat. Every head in the room swiveled toward her. She stood in the doorway, breathless, her work shift torn and dusty, her hair a wild tangle. Isolde's face contorted with fury. How dare you seize this traitor? But Ondine only had eyes for Theron. She walked forward, her steps steady and sure. She didn't plead or explain. She simply walked up the dais until she stood directly between Theron and the woman who held the poisoned cup. She met Isolde's hateful gaze, and channeling every ounce of the alpha blood that ran through her veins, she did the one thing she knew he would understand. She gave a short, sharp shake of her head. A silent, absolute command. No. Then, with a swift, deliberate motion, she knocked the goblet from Isolde's hand. It clattered to the stone floor, the dark red liquid splashing across the stones, its bitter chemical scent filling the air. A collective gasp went through the room. Isolde shrieked in fury. She attacks me, she is a savage. But Theron was not looking at Isolde. He was staring at Ondine. He had seen her choice. He had seen her stand between him and danger. He had seen her use his own silent language to defend him. In her eyes, he saw not hatred or blame, but a fierce, unwavering loyalty. He saw his mate. For 20 years, his silence had been his penance. For 20 years, his grief had been his world. But in that moment, looking at the woman who had fought her way back to his side, he knew the penance was over. A sound filled the throne room, a sound no one living had ever heard. It was rough, cracked from 2 decades of disuse, like stone grinding against stone. But it was a voice. Ondine! The single word was a thunderclap in the silence. It was raw, it was powerful. It was the voice of the Alpha King, reclaimed from the ashes of his past. He had spoken. For her. The sound shattered Isolde's composure. Her face went slack with shock and terror. The game was over. Theron rose from his throne, his full height and power seeming to fill the room. His stormy eyes were fixed on Isolde, and for the first time they held not grief, but cold, lethal fury. He didn't need to say another word. His guards knew what to do. They seized the sputtering, defeated lady and dragged her away. The council stared, dumbfounded. But Ondine only looked at Theron. He had broken his vow. He had shattered his silence. He had chosen her, not as a symbol of his guilt, but as the reason to live again. He came down from the dais and stopped in front of her. He gently cupped her face in his large, warm hands. The bond between them blazed, no longer an ache of shared sorrow, but a brilliant, radiant sun of shared victory. He looked into her eyes, and his were clear for the first time. The storm finally passed. And then he spoke again, his voice softer this time, a promise just for her. Mine. Epilogue. The morning sun streamed through the arched window, painting stripes of gold across the silk sheets. Ondine stretched, a lazy, contented motion, the sound of the waves a familiar lullaby. A heavy arm was draped across her waist, and the steady, slow beat of a heart echoed against her back. She smiled, leaning into the warmth. It had been 6 months. 6 months since the world had shifted on its axis in the throne room. Lady Isolde was exiled, her plots laid bare for all to see. The story of the lost Alpha of Silver Creek had spread like wildfire, and emissaries from the scattered remnants of her pack had begun to arrive, their hope rekindled. There were treaties to be negotiated, a future to be built, but that was work for the afternoon. Mornings were theirs. Theron was not a talkative man. His 20 years of silence had shaped him, but he spoke, in quiet, rumbling sentences, mostly to her. He would describe the currents of the sea from their balcony, or read to her from his books, his voice still a little rough, but growing stronger every day. He was telling her his stories, filling in the silent years. He stirred behind her, his lips brushing against the healed claiming mark on her shoulder. The skin was smooth now, the intricate pattern a pale, silvery mark against her skin. It was no longer a chain, but a promise. "You're awake," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her back. "I am," she said, turning in his arms to face him. The grief had not vanished from his eyes entirely. It was a part of his story, a part of theirs, but it no longer consumed him. It was a scar, not a wound. Now, when she looked at him, she saw peace. He traced the line of her jaw with his thumb. "I was reading about the Northern Cliffs customs, the Spring Festival. They exchange carved stones as tokens of intent." Ondine laughed softly, remembering the tray of perfect sea-smoothed shells he had given her in those first confusing days. "Is that so? You were ahead of your time then." A rare, small smile touched his lips. "My wolf knew. He's always been smarter than I am. He's not the only one," she teased, tapping his chest. The bond between them was a calm, steady river, a constant source of warmth and connection. She could feel his deep, abiding love for her, a force as powerful and constant as the tide. He had found his voice for her, and in doing so, he had taught her to find her own, not as a laundry maid, not as a lost princess, but as a Luna, as his equal. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, lingering kiss that tasted of the sea and home. The future would be complicated. There were 2 packs to unite, a kingdom to rule, and a shared past to honor. But as he held her, his silent, broken kingdom finally filled with light, Ondine knew they would face it together. They had found their own language, one spoken not just in words, but in touches, in shared glances, and in the unwavering certainty of the bond that had brought them through the storm. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. What was your favorite quiet moment between Ondine and Thuron? Let me know in the comments. I will see you in the next one.